I was wondering why my blowgun was leaking so much air. Yeah, that's why. I'm surprised how long these plastic fittings actually lasted. Ta-da! So now it's all one color. Except for the inside, of course. So tomorrow, more sanding, yay! Here's a collection of all the sandpaper that I've been using on my project. I start with 80 grit or 60 grit. I use that for stripping and shaping Bondo. Once I've sprayed primer, then I move on to 150 grit. I've got a few different varieties here. This is the stuff I've been using most often. This stuff lasts really long. You can also use these DA discs by hand. So you can get these cool like sanding sponges with sandpaper glued on the sides. This one is dull, but you can wrap sandpaper over top of it. If you use a block like this, keep in mind it's a little squishy. And that is nice for getting into weird contours and stuff like that, but you need to be aware that this isn't going to smooth out your finish. For that, you want some blocks like these. These happen to be Durablocks. These ones you have to glue the sandpaper on. You can buy sandpaper that has adhesive on the back. I just use regular sandpaper and I glue it on. I like these because the sandpaper is always flat. It doesn't lift off. You don't get a weird fold at the edges. But whatever sanding block you like. The longer the better. This is the block I use most often because it happens to be the same size as regular sandpaper. There is a longer block in there, but I don't really use it. I also use this block. I used this extensively when I did my body seam on the truck. Then, if I was getting ready for paint, say I did all my primer work and my filler work, and I spray primer, and this is the last coat before paint, I'll switch to 320. So I have a couple different varieties here. I have a new sanding block that happens to be 320. This one is also 320. I'll use the same blocks for this. In fact, I'll usually switch to a shorter block. So for my finish sanding, I usually use this one because I've done all my blocking already with 150 grit. I'm just making sure the surface is clean and flat and doesn't have any orange peel from the primer. So at this stage, I'm done with my 80 grit, so I'm get rid of that. And now I have a decision to make. Do I want to sand the whole truck with 150 grit? Or do I want to sand it with 320? If I sand it with 320, I can spray color right over top of it. But I don't think that this primer is ready for that. I think I'm going to have to spray another coat. So I'm going to sand it with 150 grit. Give it one last blocking to make sure it is as straight as possible. If I went over the whole thing with something like this with 320, I could skip that step. But whatever ripples are in there right now would still be there when I get to paint. I don't want that. So, I'm going to be doing 150. I need to change out this sandpaper and this sandpaper and get to it. So my idea was, couldn't I just use regular sandpaper and stick it on with something like this? This would work, right? The problem I had was I didn't want to get adhesive on here and never be able to get it off. So I put masking tape on this surface, and it's not, you know, totally sealed. And then I just spray the back of the sandpaper with this, just a little bit, just enough to make it tacky, and then I stick it onto the block. This is the sandpaper I've been using. I found it in the surplus section at Princess Auto, and it is no kidding the best sandpaper I've ever used. I can't find this anywhere, and it makes me sad because once this is gone, it's gone. Alright, so we got our strip here, and we got a little bit of bonus strip. I'll save this for later. So now I'm just going to spray a little bit on here. Make sure I get the corners. I'll let that sit for a minute or two, and then I'll stick the block on. Okay, that's probably good. Just going to make sure this surface doesn't have any dust on it. Which it did. So I'm going to stick this on. Hopefully I'll get it on there straight. Just like that. Flatten it out. That's ready for sanding. This coat of primer turned out really good. I could almost sand this with 320 and spray color on it, but there's a few problems I'd like to show you. This is a void in the body filler. This usually happens, you get a bubble trapped inside the filler when you mix it. And it's not visible until you sand it, and you sand down to that level where the bubble is, and you get this little void like that. There's a few things I could do with this. One would be nothing. I could leave it like this and sand this with 320 and spray color over top, but you'll see that through the paint. Option 2 would be, assuming I'm still in the recoat window, spray another coat of primer over top, and that will make that a little bit smaller, but it might not go away all the way. Or I can fill this with something. So I'll probably mix up a little bit of body filler and go over the whole thing and just fill all these little marks like that, because there's a few of them around here. So there's one there, two there, a little one there. There's also this, so I didn't sand that down all the way. So that's a little bit too much to sand and still have primer left over for paint. So I'm going to break through down to the filler in this area. That's why I want to spray another coat of primer. I went over the whole truck and put flags wherever I needed a little bit of filler. I just put a little skim coat to fill those little voids that I found. If you do any research into painting, you'll find when people talk about block sanding to spray a guide coat over everything. I've been skipping that step because this primer sprays out with a pretty decent texture. You can probably hear it when I run my hand over it. So I'm going to sand this until I don't see that texture anymore. Then I know it's flat. Even if I don't get all of the texture off, I just sprayed this yesterday, so I can spray, without even sanding anything, another coat of primer. So if I missed one of the low spots, the second coat will build that area up. So if you use a really long sanding block, you're basically going to be sanding down all the high spots until they're the same level as all the low spots. If you use a really short sanding block, you're going to get more waves because you'll average out this area, then this area, then this area. If I have a big block like this, I'm going to average out this area. If I use a sanding sponge or sand by hand, I'm not going to be taking any of the waves out. I'm going to be preserving it the way it is. And I could do that, but I need to spray another coat, so I might as well smooth out as much as I can. thing is looking pretty good with this coat of primer on it. Not too shabby. There's a couple little wobbles in this little edge, but no big deal. That's looking nice. This kind of blotchiness is just from the body filler. That'll go away with the next coat. So we'll get to sanding and we'll see what's going on in this area here. But yeah, I might actually be able to pull this off. This bottom edge is looking pretty good too. And I did get a coat of primer on the fuel door. I'll just go ahead and sand this with 320 and it'll be ready for paint. I even debated about not priming it at all, but I figured, yeah, why not? I also need to do something about this side of the tailgate. This tailgate has seen some things in its time. One of the reasons this tailgate is in such bad condition is there's nothing here. So I want to make something. I have a bead roller, but the problem is my bead roller isn't big enough. I'd like to run some beads going in this direction, but I can only go out to about here, and I would like to go out to at least here. So I might have to do this in 2 pieces and then join it up in the center. I could run the beads in this direction, but I think that would be annoying when I load things in the back of the truck. It would always catch on the edges. I might even just cut the piece for here and try it. How flexible is it? I think it's going to be too flexible, but who knows, right? It might be okay. This plastic primer worked out pretty good. Unfortunately, it's very thin, and I got a few runs. So I gotta sand them out, but that's okay. I have to do some sanding anyway. I'm gonna get these sanded up so I can get another coat on here right away. It didn't build a lot of this up. You can see a few of the pits in here. I'm not sure what I want to do. What I should do is fill this with epoxy, but I'm rushing because I want to spray color, so I might just ignore that. I probably will regret it, but oh well. My repairs are looking really good. I can't even really remember where they are. Even that hole is hidden. So that's a huge success, I think. This is looking really good. I think this is just going to need a sand with 320 and it's going to be ready for paint. I did notice a couple things. I missed this spot. I don't know what that is. I'll sand that out. In case you were wondering why this cutout looks so weird, there's a fender flare that goes on here, so that all gets covered. With the last coat of primer on this tailgate, it's looking really good. All this is going to need is a final sand with 320, and it's going to be ready for paint. I am extremely impressed with how good this looks. It's not perfect, and frankly, for the piece of crap that this is, it should never be perfect. Yeah, I'm going to get my 320 paper out and get to blocking. So this is what I'm going to use to sand the primer in preparation for paint. I'm going to switch out to this little block instead of the bigger block that I was using because I've already blocked it out. The majority of the sanding is done. I'm just doing one last pass just to make sure everything is flat. I'm also going to be using this little sponge for some of the weird shapes to make sure everything is sanded and smooth. Not so much for shaping. And I might roll up some of this paper and just use it in my fingers. If you do that, be aware that the tips of your fingers will sand heavier than the gaps between your fingers, and you can actually get finger marks in your paint, which you might not want. Spiders living on here already? I can actually see some scratches in the primer here from where I have sanded previously, so hopefully I can take those out when I sand this last coat. I do find it matters to use a decent sandpaper, not the cheapest sandpaper, because the grit can actually fall off and or clog up. I also find it's important to change the sandpaper often. You don't want to be wasting your time sanding with dull paper. So same principles apply with a smaller block as compared to the bigger ones. Sanding in a crosshatch like this. And never like that. So I'm going to sand up this panel and we'll have a look at it. I've got this panel sanded down with 320. You can see a few dark spots. Unfortunately, that's metal that you can see. Technically, this panel should get another coat of primer. I probably won't do that, but I'll show you what I'm going to do a bit later on. There's a quick fix for this. I just started on the driver's side. I went over the whole thing with a little block, all the flat spots, as much as I could. Now I'm going to switch to my sanding foam to finish it up. So I'm going to use this in and around the wheel well, up here. And I'm also going to go over the whole thing, just make sure I knocked off all the orange peel. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to do all my details, so all the body seams and stuff. So I've been basically treating this the same way as a regular block, sanding the same sort of pattern. So I'll show you how that works.
So I've gone over this whole thing with 320, but I made a bit of an oopsie. I went through to the metal. So what should you do in a situation like this? Well, that needs to have primer on it before paint. Could spray this whole thing with primer and sand it again, but frankly I don't have the time, so I'm just going to spray a little self-etch on it. Now I'm going to let that dry, and then sand it. And hopefully I don't sand through in the same spot again, because that would be annoying. This fuel door just got one coat of primer, but I figured that was all it needed. I'm going to sand this with 320 and then it will be ready for paint.
So here we are outside, getting ready to spray some color. I'm doing this outside because I don't have the space inside. I already had problems spraying the primer, so hopefully I have better luck doing this outside. I wiped this down already, but I'll wipe it down again just before I spray the color. So I'm gonna go mix it up and be right back. Let's shoot some paint.
Apparently I'm out of paint.
So before you paint, you want to have some kind of plan. Where are you going to paint? Where are you going to put your parts before they're painted? And where are you going to put your parts after they're painted? Because you don't want to be handling wet paint and wondering where to put it. Also, you want to prep the area. Make sure there's nothing around here that you wouldn't mind overspray on. And make sure that you don't have any dust. I've wetted the ground down here, so that should help a little bit. I'm painting outside. I'm going to get bugs, leaves, bird poop, who knows. But I'm okay with it. So my plan is, I'm going to spray my stuff here, and then I'll throw it in the garage to let it flash off. That should reduce the amount of stuff that lands on it. That does mean I have to do a little bit of prep work ahead of time to make sure I have places to put things after they're painted. You're also going to want to have a plan of how you want to paint whatever you're painting. So, where do you want to paint and where don't you want to paint? Well, I want to get paint up here. I want to make sure these hooks are painted all the way around. I do want to paint this return, this bottom part, as well as that part of the hinge, because you see that. I could do this in 2 steps. I could flip this over halfway in between. I'd rather not. So I've got it elevated like this, so I can spray up. Now the tempting part is to spray all the important stuff first, because that's the part you care about, so you want to make sure you have enough paint for it. That's a mistake. You want to paint the unimportant stuff first, because if you get overspray on the important stuff after you've sprayed it, it'll look bad. If you get overspray on the unimportant stuff, it doesn't matter, it's not important, right? So the first things I'm going to do, probably come in here, I'll spray these hooks on each side, try to get a little bit underneath, because that's a tricky spot. Then I'll go around, and I'll spray all the way around this way. And I'll paint it with the hinges up like this. And I also want to get some paint in here, so I'll probably paint from this direction while I do this. And I also want to make sure I get paint in here, so I'll do that. Then I'll flip these down and I'll spray the top. Easy, right?
So step 1 is to make sure there's no dust on here. Step 2, wipe it down and make sure there's no grease on it.